Hey, what's going on everybody? Gareth here with FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today we're going to be showing you how to adjust valve lash on an S54 engine. So in this particular car's case, this is an E46 sedan, obviously therefore a swapped car. We do understand that S54 engines are swapped in a lot of different cars. Sometimes they're even in non-BMW. So we're not even really focusing on the fact that this could be a BMW M3. Rather, we're just simply talking about how to adjust valve lash properly on one of these engines. What makes the S54 engine interesting is that it has a solid valve train. It doesn't have hydraulic lifters. Rather, you have rocker arms that push down on the valves themselves, and in between the valve and the rocker arm, you have tiny little shims like what's in this box from Wiseco. In order to measure the valve lash, we're going to be using this feeler gauge set from BMW, which has the correct ranges. Both the intake and exhaust valves have a different range, so we have to figure those out first. If one of the valves is out of spec, we then have to pull the shim out, look at the shim, measure it, and then adjust accordingly in order to get the correct valve lash. And then from there, you're of course removing the valve cover, so we'll have to do the valve cover gaskets. And to make this job easier, it is best to pull the spark plugs out as well, so you can easily turn the engine over by hand. And it really doesn't make sense to reinstall the spark plugs, so we'll be replacing those as well with factory engine K plugs. This job should be done every 25 to 30,000 miles. So it is pretty much a common maintenance item on these engines, but we're going to show you how to do all this properly. But before we get into it, let's talk about some of the tools you need to do this job. Socket-wise, 8mm, 10mm, 13mm, 16mm, 17mm. I have a couple options: 1/4 inch, 3/8 drive, T25, T30, T50. If you can get this special socket from BMW turn over the crank, we do offer that here at FCP Euro. It's definitely going to help you. Past that, the proper size feeler gauge set, the shim magnet pickup tool. You'll want some kind of micrometer in order to measure the shim thickness to sort of make an assessment of what new shim needs to go in to get to the correct clearance. Fan clutch wrench set, spark plug socket, spark plug tool to help thread it in. Sort of your general assortment of tools. If you can get a pocket screwdriver with a magnet at the end, that's going to be super useful just in case you drop a shim somewhere in the cylinder head, which, to be honest with you, it's pretty common it's going to happen. Past that, a variety of ratchets, screwdrivers, and if you have access to electric tools and a torque wrench, you're also going to want those as well. So that said, let's go ahead and jump into it and we'll show you how to do this job. All right, step one in our valve lash adjustment video, we're going to go ahead and remove the splash shield from underneath the car. Two reasons. Number one, there's always a chance you're going to drop something in the engine bay. And number two, there are two screws that you need to remove from the fan shroud, because we do need to take the fan shroud and the fan clutch off to do this adjustment. It's much easier to gain access to those two lower screws on the radiator if the splash shield isn't there. So we're going to start here. 3 8mm screws in the back, and then we have 4 Phillips heads in the front. And then these Phillips head screws are 1/4 turn, and they're encapsulated in the splash shield, so you don't have to worry about taking them all the way out. So like I said, normally there's 2 T25 screws holding the fan shroud to the radiator. Not on today's video, but one would be located here, and then there's another one located here. So we're gonna have to go ahead and get those replaced, but you would need to take the splash shield off in order to gain access to that. So that is step one in the process. Next, we're going to lower the car, and then we will go ahead and start removing the fan clutch and the fan shroud and all the other associated parts that we need in order to gain access. All right, so the first thing that we're going to have to do is remove the fan shroud, the suction cowl here for the air intake, and also the fan clutch. Obviously, not all applications are going to have this, but for your typical E46 M3 or any S54 swapped BMW, it's probably going to look just like this. So we have a bunch of these expanding rivets. I'm going to go ahead and remove them. Go ahead and put this off to the side. We have more expanding rivets that hold more of the fan shroud in place, so we'll go ahead and remove these. We have another one kind of tucked down here. Now we can go ahead and remove this portion of the fan shroud. We'll move that out of the way. And I also want to go ahead and get this portion of the fan shroud loosened up. Kind of sits on the main portion of the fan shroud, it like kind of clicks in place. And then we also have a rivet back here that we need to remove. The expanding rivet we have to remove is right here. These are not the correct plier for this, but I'm going to go ahead and try to use them anyway. And then we can go ahead and sort of dislodge this a little bit, like so. So this part of the fan shroud is going to stay in place because it physically can't be removed due to the upper radiator hose. So the key there is to kind of move it into a position where it's not going to interfere when you pull the main fan shroud out. So we're going to go ahead and knock the fan clutch loose while we have access here. These are reverse threaded. So we're going to put our counter hole down, try to get on the head of the water pump pulley bolts that are the furthest separated. Here we go, it's loose. Now we're going to go ahead and disconnect our AUC sensor. We're going to disconnect our front pusher fan for the AC condenser. The key here is to kind of tuck these wires out of the way. And now we have another T25 screw here. And then there's also a T25 screw that's supposed to be on the other side, but there's actually only one T25 screw holding this fan shroud on, which is this one here. Also, for what it's worth, the T25 at the upper right-hand corner of the fan shroud is also the longest. The other ones are T6 by 20. This one's a like T6 by 35 or 40 or something like that. It's significantly longer. The long one always goes here. That's all you need to know. And now, I'm just going to spin the fan so that it starts to unthread from the water pump. You can see the nut spinning. Make sure that our fan shroud is loose, which it is. I'm going to hold on to the fan so it doesn't go crashing down and maybe damage the radiator. And now we can go ahead and start pulling the fan shroud and the fan out together. Pull the fan out, which will give us a little bit extra room to mess with the shroud. And now that we have the shroud out, you can actually see the 4 locations for where the screws are. One here, one here, one here at the side. This is on the left, and then one at the lower one. Next up, we're going to go ahead and remove our cowl cover here in the back for the HVAC blower motor assembly and obviously the cabin filters here. So we'll go ahead and pull this out. These are 1/4 turn fasteners. We'll go ahead and pull this out of the way. Needs a new cabin filter while we're in here. We'll go ahead and pull this little insulation piece here. That'll just make it easier to work with a little bit on. We'll go ahead and pull this conduit holder off. Should just slide off, but this one is holding on for dear life. For some reason this is not releasing. I'll have to take a look at that, but the other option is to simply unclick it and then just pull the wires out. Next up we have 4 T30 screws in the back here that we need to undo, which will allow us to remove what's left of the cowl here. And that gives us access to the entire top of the engine. I have to remove the serpentine belts in order to get the crank pulley cover off, because that's how we're going to bar the engine over once we get to that point. I like to just mark the orientation of the belt if I'm going to be reinstalling it, because these things wear grooves in the pulleys, and if you sometimes reinstall them in the opposite direction of how they were spinning, you sometimes get noise. So we're going to be reusing these belts, so I'm just marking them with an arrow. That stuff will obviously wear out very quick anyway, but that's just for my knowledge later on when I reinstall it. I'm going to go ahead and remove the AC compressor belt first, since that's on the outside. It's a 16mm socket for the tensioner. Simply push downward and then slip the belt off. And the next, we're going to use a T50 socket here on the tensioner pulley for the main belt. And again, we're going to push down. This is hydraulic, so it's going to have a little bit of resistance. And then we can go ahead and just slip the pulley off, slip the belt off rather. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and remove the harmonic balancer / crank pulley cover bolt. There's 6 13mm screws that hold that in place. That is so that I can bar the engine over by hand once I get the spark plugs pulled out. Now the cover itself does allow for the use of a 32mm hex. However, that is a stamped piece, and I find that fitment of a 32mm socket on that is actually kind of poor. So I have the special tool for barring the engine over by hand, and I prefer to use that, so it's just 6 more screws to remove. That's my choice. It's also going to give me a chance to take a better look at the crank pulleys and also the harmonic balancer, since S54s are known for destroying harmonic balancers. So I want to go ahead and take a look at that while we're doing this job. All right, so after taking out the 6 bolts that hold the cover to the crank pulley and the cover will both come out together. So we simply reach down and grab them. And this is the cover I was saying that you could technically turn the engine with, but it's just stamped and it's got corrosion on it. And I'd rather just turn by those 4 bolts that are holding the harmonic balancer to the crankshaft anyway. We are going to go ahead and take the beauty cover, or cosmetic cover, off the engine. In order to do that, we need to remove one of the crankcase breather hoses right here. This is one of those classic pinch the quote-unquote quick release, and also then try not to break it. Which, you know, these things are pretty stubborn, but the key is to make sure that thing is squeezed and rock back and forth so you can get that O-ring to release. Once that is released, you can then just kind of go ahead and rotate it out of the way, like so. And now, take our oil filler cap off, and then take a 13 millimeter 1/4-inch socket, and we'll remove these nuts that hold the cosmetic cover to the valve cover. And then we'll go ahead and put our oil filler cap back on. So next up, we need to start removing some of the components from the valve cover before we can get the valve cover out of the way. That includes both ignition coils and some of these electrical housings. So we're going to start with the ignition coils first. These are the classic pencil style BMW coils. They've been around since the introduction of the S54 engine, so technically late 2000. But these same style pencil coils have been used on like pretty much every BMW engine, with the exception of a couple since then, and upwards of like 2020. So if you ever worked on a BMW before, you've probably seen these. And we're looking for cleanliness of the coil. There shouldn't be any oil. If there's oil inside the spark plug tube, we're gonna have to go in there with compressed air and try to get that oil out of there. We don't want to take the spark plug out and then have that oil drop into the engine. Could potentially cause a hydrolock. So want to be careful with that. So we'll take a look at these as we pull them out. And in case you're watching this and you're wondering, no, I am not marking which ignition coil came from which cylinder. They're all the same. They don't need to go back in any particular order. There's nothing wrong with these. The car ran perfectly fine beforehand. So next up, we need to get the ignition coil harness out of the way. We need to disconnect some of these connectors there. So I'm gonna go ahead and unbolt using an 8 millimeter socket the ignition coil cover, or the ignition coil harness housing from the valve cover. Just feel like that is the path of least resistance as opposed to trying to release this metal clip. And now we should be able to just sort of lift this up and out of the way. The key in all this is just to you know, find a place where all the stuff wants to rest. And then if you notice down here, you have this bolt that holds this harness ground in place. What I'm going to do is unbolt that, and then we'll be able to take this entire harness and flip it over to the side. That ground is a 13 millimeter bolt. And then what we'll do here is just thread the bolt back in finger tight as a reminder to us later on to reattach the ground. Because if we don't do that, we're gonna have a bad time. All these wires just sort of connected to the back of the valve cover. We're gonna get these off and out of the way so we can unbolt the valve cover and remove from the top of the engine. So what I like to do here, need to unplug these O2 sensors just to give myself room to work with. I like to just take a zip tie, put a zip tie on one side of the harness and a zip tie on the other side of the harness. That way later when I come to plug this back together, I don't have to sit here and ponder which one goes where. I'm almost positive you can't plug these in correctly, but you know what? I'd rather not find that out later on. So it's just a little trick that I like to do to remove guesswork later on. And then we can pretty much just let this entire harness sit down on the side of the engine bay like so. All right, next up, we're gonna pull our spark plugs out. I'm using this hilariously long 5/8 or 16mm spark plug socket with a magnet in there. Don't judge me. Okay, so at this point, we can go ahead and start removing the valve cover. We have a bunch of 10mm cap screws, or cap nuts rather, we have to take off. And once we have those nuts removed, we can then go ahead and pull the valve cover. Next up, we need to release the PCV oil return line, which is right here. It's got a 17mm banjo bolt. So we'll go ahead and loosen that now. And we'll make sure that our crush washers here, these are copper. I'm going to replace them with aluminum, but I want to make sure that I grab both of them. And I'll go ahead and keep them with the banjo bolt. And then once I get the valve cover off, I'll thread this banjo bolt back to the valve cover, just so I don't forget. And at this point, we are good to go with pulling the valve cover off. I like to rock it back and forth to break the seal. The unfortunate part for us is that a lot of RTV was used on this valve cover at some point. So we're gonna have to do a lot of cleaning. Like the gasket was physically RTV'd in place, so we're gonna have to do some cleaning for that. There we go. That's the cylinder head. Decent amount of mileage on this, so obviously some oil varnish, but nothing too concerning at the moment. Go ahead and take this gasket and throw it right in the trash. You can see the amount of RTV that was used to stick it, I guess, to the valve cover. No need to do that. Doesn't actually accomplish anything. So, fun fact, you can usually tell an earlier S54 versus a later S54 by the little plastic screen that's in the oil galley. Right down there. Those were installed specifically to prevent the valve shims from falling into the oil galley, because it is possible for, even with the BMW pickup tool, to have one fall. And while we're here, we'll go ahead and pull the spark plug tube seals up and out. We're going to be replacing these. They always kind of stick to the spark plug tubes, so I think it's easier for people to forget that this is a serviceable item. But all right, so what we're going to be doing here is, I find it easiest to do the intake side first and then the exhaust side. There's two different specs, so it's really just best to work your way down one side of the engine and then start the other one. So what I want to do is I want to bar the engine over, which is why the spark plugs have been removed. I'm using the special adapter for BMW that goes over the 4 eTorx bolts at the front of the crank. And we're going to go ahead and rotate the engine in a clockwise direction. With the spark plugs out, super easy to move the engine over. I'm going to start on cylinder number 1, which is labeled here E2. That's for the intake side. And what we want to do is we want to get the cam lobes pointed directly up. So you want the fat side pointing downward. So right about there, I'm going to say is directly straight up. And we need to do our first measurement that way. So our spec for the intake side is 0.18 to 0.23 millimeters. I'm going to start with a 0.20 gauge. And what I'm feeling for here is I want to feel drag, like peanut butter over toast or something like that. It can't just slide in loosely, but you shouldn't have to force it in either. And 0.2 is dead in the middle of the spec, which would be ideal. So I'm going to start here on intake valve number 1, and that's not going in, so that's going to be more down towards the 0.18 range. And then if we come over here to intake valve number 2, the key is really get these going dead straight. It goes in, and I can move it back and forth, and I can feel the drag. I mean, I'm not going to say that's like too tight, but I can move it freely. Number 1, I can't even get that in. I'm going to bump up to the 0.25 feeler gauge here for the second one. Now that's obviously over spec, but I want to make sure it's not past the 0.23. I can't even get that in. And then for number 1, the 0.25 obviously doesn't go in. And then obviously lower end of the spec, 0.15 millimeters. It goes in no problem. This obviously goes in no problem. So I know that number 2 is definitely within spec. Number 1 on cylinder number 1 is a little bit on the tight side. So I want to go ahead and open up that tolerance. In order to do that, we're gonna have to use a, let's see. It feels like it will slide in, but we definitely need to open up that tolerance a little bit. So to do that, we're gonna have to use a slightly thinner shim. So we have to measure the shim that comes out, and I'll show you how to pull that out and show you how to select the next one. The rocker arms are held in with these little stamped clips. I'm gonna go ahead and make sure that I pull this one out so that it doesn't go over the cam lobes, but it just pops right out. Basically just locks the rocker arms in like that. And then I'm gonna reach in here, lift the rocker arm. You can see it and you can hear it moving. That's the clearance basically, or the valve lash. That's also why S54s have that ticking sound, because of the solid valve train. That's literally what you're hearing. And you know, I can feel the tolerance difference here. And then we'll just slide the rocker arm off. And now we have this special little magnet pickup tool from BMW. This will slide underneath the cam, and it has a little magnet, and then we basically lift straight up and pull our shim out. The shim sits in a little bucket on top of the valve, or on the valve keeper. So it's really just, you come in, you'll feel it grab, and then you pick it up and pull it out. It's that simple. So here's the shim that we pulled out. Take a feeler, we're gonna take a measurement here of the shim. And this is coming in at 2.28 millimeters. Now we said that number one was a little bit on the tight side, so we're gonna go ahead and shim this down. So in our Wiseco kit here, we have a couple different size options. 2.28, we know that this is 2.28. We're gonna go ahead and drop that in there, because we can go ahead and reuse that shim later. I'm gonna drop it down to a 2.24, so we're taking off 0.04 of a millimeter in the shim size, and that'll help open up that tolerance. The Wiseco shims are labeled. I'm gonna go ahead and put that pointing downward. That way in the future, somebody can actually see what size it was when it started. Stick the shim to the little magnet. We're gonna come on underneath. We're gonna drop it down in the little bucket, pull our tool back. We're gonna lift the rocker arm up, slide it back over on top of the valve, and then we're gonna go ahead and reinstall our rocker arm keeper. Want to make sure that it clicks in place. You'll see it bottom out like so, and you can see that it is on the rocker shaft. And now we're going to come with our 0.20 millimeter feeler gauge on number one, and it slides in, and I can feel some drag. And I'll just check it against number two. Like I said, number two is a little bit maybe on the tighter side, so maybe I can change that shim size as well. But since the feeler gauge goes in and there's some drag, I'm going to call both of these in spec. And just to confirm that we're not over spec, the 0.25 millimeter, which is well past, I can't get that to fit in, and I can't get that to fit in. So that is our valve adjustment for cylinder number one for both valve one and valve two. So at this point, we're gonna go ahead and check the valve lash on all the other intake valves. It's gonna be the exact same process all the way down the line. We're gonna be rotating the engine over to make sure that the camshaft is pointing in the correct direction. The specification for BMW's coolant temp needs to be below 35 degrees Celsius. 35 degrees Celsius being the absolute maximum temperature. However, it is best to have the engine at basically room temperature. In this case, the car's been sitting for well over a day, so we're doing this as the engine is cold, and that's going to give you probably the most accurate reading possible on these measurements, since everything expands with temperature. So again, just going to go down the line, check all of our valve lash clearances like we did on cylinder number one, and then after that we'll go ahead and move on to the exhaust side. right, so just did the intake side. Everything is basically within 0.2 millimeter spec, give or take, you know, 1/100th here and there of a mil. Basically, like I said, I'm trying to do this valve adjustment. I want to be dead in the middle of what the specification is. Now that we're on to the exhaust side, that specification is a little bit more open. So the specification for the exhaust valves is 0.28 to 0.33 millimeters. I'm going for 0.3 millimeters. And again, it's the exact identical process of going down the line, moving the camshaft to the position it needs to be in. Again, I'm going to start in cylinder number 1 and then work my way towards the back. So I'm going to use the 0.3 millimeter feeler gauge. So I'm going to start on cylinder number 1, feel drag, come on to valve number 2, and the 0.3 doesn't actually fit in there. So that's a little bit tight, and I could argue that maybe number 1 or valve number 1 on cylinder 1 could use a little bit of adjustment, and number 2 on cylinder number 1 definitely needs it. So again, we'll just pop the rocker arm keeper or retainer out. I'm going to start on the one that is the loosest, or the tightest rather. Come in here with the tool, get the shim. So this is 2.3 mil, and our 3 mil was a little bit on the tight side. So I'll take a couple hundredths off of it. I have a shim here that is 2.27. Actually, it's more like 2.28, so 2 hundredths. We'll put that in first. And there we go. This is exactly the issue on the exhaust side, is it's very easy for the shims to fall out because of the angle of the valve. So you want to make sure that it is really seated in there. Love to say I did that intentionally, but I didn't. And on the same note, later S54s have these really nice plastic covers on the oil return so your shims don't fall in there. So we just saw everything working there as intended. So pull that back off. I'll recenter the shim, put it in. Really just want to make sure that it stays in place. There we go. Move it back, move the rocker arm back into position. And definitely get the 0.3 mil in there now. And it has the drag that I think I want. Number 1 feels a little loose, so we can see if we can tighten that up a little bit. Similar situation, just push the rocker arm off. Come in here, get the shim. We'll try this one, 2.27. Now, it is okay to use used shims. Sometimes you might find that a used one has just the right amount of size that you need in order to get to where you need to be in terms of clearance. See how this feels. Actually got tighter. So pull this back out. I'm actually going to put the original shim back in there just because it was fine. It was just a little bit on the tight side, but I was still able to get the feeler gauge in there. Nice. Perfect. Both of these valves are basically the same now. 0.30 and way out of spec 0.35. Won't even fit in there. So went ahead and checked. Both the exhaust valves on cylinder 1 feel pretty much the same at 0.3 mil. The 0.35 millimeter won't fit in, so you know it's still within that spec window. Now it's just a matter of repeating it for cylinders 2 through 6, and then once we're done with that, we go ahead and reassemble the car. Here we go. Let's do the spark plugs. We'll use this cool little installation tool from BMW. I actually talked about this before. Make sure that you get your thread started without potentially cross-threading the spark plug, which is always a good thing. And I'm going to say this now. Please do not put anti-seize on your spark plugs. It's not required. In fact, NGK and Bosch and BMW all recommend that you don't. And we're going to follow that recommendation. And there's really two reasons why you don't need to. Number one, that silver plating that you see is to prevent any kind of seizing. And number two, and this is probably the more important thing, the spark plug needs to ground to the cylinder head. Too much anti-seize, or the wrong anti-seize, could prevent that from happening. Or too much anti-seize could contaminate the tip of the spark plug, or anti-seize, this would be the worst scenario, acts as a torque multiplier, and you could potentially over-tighten your spark plugs and strip your aluminum cylinder head. You don't want that either. So, install dry the way that they recommend. I know that this spark plug socket is pretty impressive. If you're interested, we'll also drop a link for it. Torque spec on these spark plugs, they're M12 by 125, 23 Newton meters. Now, I know that this spark plug socket looks ridiculous, but there is one major advantage to it. It's very solid, so there's no flex. So as you're torquing the spark plug, you don't have to worry about any potential false torque readings. So now we're going to go ahead and reinstall the valve cover. We're going to start by putting the spark plug tube seals back on the cylinder head. These just sort of sit in place. Just slide them on down. And then we do need to apply some RTV. So here at the Vanos unit, you'll see where the Vanos unit actually meets the cylinder head. There's that sort of line right there. We need to go ahead and put a little bit of RTV there. And then we also need to put RTV here at the back corners where the half moons go. So right there, that hard straight line. We also need to put some RTV on all four corners there as well. That'll make sure that the valve cover is not leaking. And you know, when it comes to RTV, truly, less is often more. You don't need to go crazy on here. It's just a nice thin coating. One thing to know about the valve cover gasket is it's fairly rigid, except here in the front and the back. The half moons, this little groove has to sit in the cylinder head with these outer edges being on the outside and towards the inside. So just need to place that down. It doesn't need to be stuck to the valve cover or anything like that, so don't worry about that. Just go ahead and push it back. Obviously went ahead and cleaned all of our surfaces here. Valve cover gasket's placed. We'll go ahead and grab the valve cover now. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the banjo bolt from the valve cover. Remember, put that there earlier just so we didn't misplace it. It's going to be difficult to put the valve cover back in with the banjo bolt just hanging on the side because the banjo fitting's right there and it's not that flexible. So now take our valve cover and we need to bring this all the way back without disrupting the valve cover gasket. Just going to feel behind and make sure the half moons are sitting correctly, which they are. Valve cover in position. Remember our valve cover cap nuts. The studded ones were towards the outside. This is what secures the cosmetic cover to the valve cover. And then every single other cap nut uses the thicker grommet. Also worth noting, there's two different size grommets that are used for these cap nuts. The 3 cap nuts in the front need to use the lower profile version. The thicker ones are only going to be used for the ones towards the rear. So you're going to get 3 of these. Make sure the thin ones are in the front. You might have a situation where you took off a cap nut in the front and had a thicker one on. Make sure you put the thinner ones towards the front. That's all you need to do. Torque spec on the valve cover cap nuts is going to be 10 Newton meters. Just want to make sure that these are evenly torqued, so we're going to go side to side. basically work back to front. The whole thing here is we want to make sure that the sealing grommets are compressed. That's how they seal. So I'm just going to go ahead in a alternating pattern or Z pattern. So next up, since the valve cover is installed, we need to reinstall this banjo bolt for the PCV oil return. Put brand new crush washers on the banjo bolt. Not really a lot of room to work with here, so kind of feed the crush washer in as I'm pushing the banjo bolt like that, so that it actually lines up. Start the bolt by hand. Make sure that it's threading, which it is. It was a 17 millimeter, so I'll use a small ratchet to get it started even more. Torque spec for this banjo bolt is 19 Newton meters. Now, at this point, we're going to go ahead and start rerouting our harness back into position. So back here, I want to make sure that the harness is anchored to the valve cover like so. That's how it was originally. We have our O2 sensor plugs. We'll just kind of leave them there for now. And then we have all of this wiring that needs to sit on the valve cover. So we're just pretty much just trying to put it back to where it was when we started. Next up, we're going to go ahead and bring our ignition coil wiring housing, if you want to call it that. It needs to sit over here. Remember, we have the ground down here on the side of the cylinder head. Can't flip it back the other way. It simply won't line up. So if it's not lining up, there's your problem. Want to make sure that that is sitting where it needs to. While we're here, we'll take the bolt out for the ground, and we will line it all up and get it started. Tighten that down in just 1 second. We have our small little 8 millimeter fasteners here. We'll put back in. We'll tighten those down in a second. And then this larger harness sits over the top like that. And when the beauty cover goes back on, that'll be bolted back down, but that sort of sandwiches everything together. You can actually see right here how it just kind of clicks into place. So that's your general orientation for all the wiring. But we also need to put our ignition coils back in. That'll be the last thing that goes on. Let's plug our O2 sensors back in. And by the way, these are keyed. So you actually can't plug the wrong one in the wrong one, but next up, we'll just go ahead and tighten down our ignition coil harness ground. Pretty important. If you fail to do this, you might find that your car doesn't run or runs extremely poor. So next up, we'll start installing our ignition coils. The key on these is to make sure that the connector is fully seated. So I like to push them in all the way by hand, and then drop the lock tab down and then press them into place. You'll feel them kind of just click down onto the valve cover. And the reason for pushing the connector in by hand all the way, as opposed to relying on this lock, is it is possible to close the lock without actually having the connector fully seated, and then you'll have a misfire, and then you have to diagnose where the misfire is coming from. It's caught me out before, it's caught many people out before, so my way of avoiding that problem is to not use the locking mechanism to pull the connector in. I also want to make sure that our little 8 millimeter screws that hold the ignition coil wiring conduit in place is tightened down like so. Here we go, nice. And now we can kind of just plop this into position. Like I said, when the beauty cover goes on, it'll be locked into place. We have this one tab here that's still connected, so that'll just sort of hold it all together at the moment. All right, next up, we're gonna go ahead and drop the cosmetic cover back on the engine. Not only does it seal in the heat, it also seals in the debris. Good. Take our breather hose, torque it back over, connect it back in like so. We'll put the cosmetic cover nuts back in, start them by hand, and then we'll tighten them down. All right, next up, we're gonna go ahead and put the cowl cover back on. This is for the blower motor slash cabin filter housing. Pretty much only just lines up one way, sits into place like so. Secured with these T30 screws. Yes, I'm reinstalling this cabin filter cover with the really dirty cabin filter. We'll let the vehicle owner know. But now would be a great time to replace it. All right, we'll go ahead and reinstall the cover that holds these wires in place. Now we're gonna move towards the front of the engine since we have everything assembled up top. We're gonna reinstall our crank pulley here. Remember, remove this in order to bar the engine over by hand. I find it easier to take a bolt with a socket and kind of like line it up and try to find a bolt hole in the crankshaft. It'll basically line up pretty much like that. I know you can't see anything on camera, but we do have a view of what it looked like when it came apart, so show you that again. 6 13mm screws we need to put back in, just line them up, and then we'll torque them down. So now we're gonna go ahead and reinstall our belt. Rotation is this way, hence the arrow. Yes, that idler pulley is noisy. Yes, that tensioner pulley is noisy, but we have a full video on how to replace those parts. So if you are interested in doing so, now's the time. So really what we're gonna do here is route our belt. The good news is with the Serpentine belt routing is you can only put it on one way. So if it's too tight, it's not correct. The proper belt routing comes around the water pump, underneath the idler, over the alternator, down around the power steering pump, loops around the main crank pulley, and then it loops back around here on the tensioner. Take a T50 socket. We'll release tension from the tensioner. Get the belt around the crank pulley, and then lastly, we can loop it back around the tensioner pulley. There we go. Bingo. All right, the AC compressor belt's a little bit easier. Again, we have the arrow pointing the direction that it travels. We loop it up over the top of the tensioner pulley like so. And then with a 16mm socket or wrench, we'll just detension the tensioner. And once it's all lined up, it will look like that. Next up, we're going to sort of slide our fan shroud down into position. We'll then grab our fan and fan clutch assembly, sort of sneak that down at the same time. And what we need to do is get the fan clutch started on the water pump while also getting the fan shroud lined up and clear of any kind of obstruction. It's a good time. So we're there, and we need to spin this counterclockwise as we're facing it, but actually it's going to be spinning to the left since it's reverse thread. So now that we got the fan shroud lined up and the fan started on the water pump, we'll install this long T25 up here at the top. There's 4 T25 screws that hold the fan shroud to the radiator. In this particular car's case, 3 of the shorter ones are missing. So we don't have that on hand at the moment, so that'll be done at a later date. We'll go ahead and thread our fan the rest of the way until it bottoms out on its own. And then we'll go ahead and give it just a little extra persuasion. The nice thing is being reverse threaded, can't really come loose on its own. So you don't need to make it ridiculously tight, it just needs to be tight. Done. Just needs to be snugged up, don't go crazy. If you feel like you're about to stroke out or pull a muscle, it's too tight. We have one of these rivets that we need to install for part of the fan shroud on this side. Go ahead and secure that. So you're going to push through like so, and then we can push the center section in. Next up, we're going to go ahead and plug our pusher fan assembly back in. Drop that down. We'll connect our AUC sensor like so. Next up, we have this secondary fan shroud we need to install. It sort of secures in place as a little notch that it slides in onto the main fan shroud. And then we have a expanding rivet here and an expanding rivet here that we need to push in. Those are the shallower ones. Next up, we'll reinstall the suction hood here for the intake. These are the longer expanding rivets. We're all done up top. Now I just need to lift the car up, put the splash shield underneath, and it's a wrap. At this point in the order of operations, if you still had the screws for the lower portion of the fan shroud, you would install those, and then we'll go ahead and put the forward splash shield back on. 4 screws total, 4 Phillips heads, 3 8mm. Go ahead and just lay it up there, line it up. Phillips head screws are 1/4 turn. And then we have our 8mm self tappers here in the rear that go up into the reinforcement plate. So there we go. That's how you would go about adjusting valve lash on an S54 engine. Obviously, depending on what chassis the S54 engine is in, some of the steps are going to be a little bit different. But on an E46, whether an M3 or just a swapped sedan or any other chassis type E46, the overall process is going to be exactly the same. The biggest thing is really is going to be taking your time, measuring the clearances. Know that you're probably going to drop a shim or two while you're doing the valve adjustments, and just know that having magnetic pickup tools on hand to go ahead and grab those shims when they fall into a really awkward place is going to be one of those things that you need. But past that, very straightforward, pretty easy to do, oddly soothing and therapeutic. But I'd say the biggest challenges again are taking your time, making sure that all the measurements are good, and make sure that you have consistent drag between both the intake and exhaust side when you're using the feeler gauges. But past that, we hope you learned something. If you have any questions or comments, leave in the comment box below. We'll make sure we get back to you. Hit that like button if you liked this video, and hit subscribe. We have a lot more videos on the way, and as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching. I'm now going to go wash my hands too.